Picture this. You're deep in the Vietnamese jungle. Insects buzzing around your head, sweat dripping into your eyes, and suddenly, ambush. Your squad's most powerful weapon roars to life, then falls silent. Jammed. Again. The M60 machine gun was supposed to save American lives in Vietnam, but ask any veteran who carried one and you'll hear stories that'll make your blood run cold. Some called it a lifesaver. Others, they called it a death sentence. Before we dive into this one, seriously, grab yourself some coffee, maybe some snacks, get comfortable, because this story is way more twisted than you'd think. We're talking about a weapon that was supposed to revolutionize American firepower, but ended up with one of the darkest reputations in military history. And hey, if you're into these deep dives into military history, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you're going to want to stick around for what comes next. This isn't just about a gun, it's about the men who were forced to carry it, and the brutal reality of warfare that nobody talks about. So yeah, let's get into this. Okay, so let me take you back to the years right after World War II ended. The American military brass, they're sitting in their offices looking at battlefield reports, and they've got this massive headache. See, during the war, American infantry units were carrying this ridiculous mix of weapons. You'd have one guy with a Thompson submachine gun, another with an M1 Garand rifle, someone else lugging around a Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, and then you'd have machine gun teams hauling these heavy M1919 Brownings. Every single one of these weapons used different ammunition, different parts, different everything. Now, imagine you're the logistics guy trying to keep all these soldiers supplied across Europe or the Pacific. It was an absolute nightmare. You're shipping different calibers of ammunition, different spare parts, different cleaning kits. It was chaos, pure chaos. But here's where it gets interesting. The Americans had been fighting the Germans, right? And the Germans, as brutal as they were, they had figured something out that was actually pretty brilliant from a military standpoint. They had these machine guns called the MG-34 and the MG-42. You've probably heard of the MG-42. Soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw because of the terrifying sound it made when firing. That thing could spit out rounds so fast it sounded like cloth being ripped apart. What made these German guns special, though, wasn't just the rate of fire. It was the concept behind them. See, the Germans designed these as what they called general-purpose machine guns. One weapon that could do multiple jobs. You could use it as a light machine gun with a bipod, carrying it with your squad. You could mount it on a tripod for defensive positions as a heavy machine gun. You could stick it on vehicles, on tanks, wherever you needed firepower. And here's the really clever part. They designed it with this quick barrel change system. Because when you're firing that many rounds that fast, the barrel gets hot enough to literally glow red. You need to swap it out. So American military planners are looking at this German system and they're thinking, why don't we have something like this? Why are we making things so complicated? By the late 1940s and early 1950s, they started working on their own general-purpose machine gun. They looked at the feeding system of the MG-42, how the belt fed into the weapon. They examined the FG-42, which was a German paratroop rifle with interesting ergonomics and a pistol grip design. Then they added their own engineering into the mix. The idea was to take the best features from these proven designs and create something even better. What they eventually came up with, after years of development and testing, was designated the M60. And soldiers who would eventually use it in combat, they had a much more colorful name for it. They called it the Pig, and not in an affectionate way, if you know what I mean. Now, around this same time, NATO was forming up. All these allied countries getting together, and they had a smart idea. They said, look, we don't all need to use the exact same weapons, but what if we all used the same ammunition? That way, American forces could share ammo with British forces, with French forces, with whoever. If World War III kicked off with the Soviets, you'd want that kind of interoperability. So NATO standardized on a cartridge, the 7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO round. It was powerful, accurate, and effective. This would be the round the M60 was designed around. By 1956, after extensive development and countless prototypes, the U.S. Army finally had their general-purpose machine gun. It used a gas operating system, which meant it used some of the gases from firing to cycle the action. It fired from an open bolt for reliability. It was fed by a disintegrating link belt, meaning as the rounds were fired, the metal links holding the belt together would fall away. And it had that quick barrel change system the Germans had proven was necessary. On paper, this thing looked fantastic. It weighed about 23 pounds, which sounds heavy, until you realize it was replacing the M1919 Browning that weighed 31 pounds. It was more compact, easier to carry, but it still maintained a serious rate of fire at around 550 to 650 rounds per minute. That's roughly 10 rounds every single second when you pulled that trigger. The M60 was officially standardized in 1957. The plan was for it to replace multiple weapons. The old BAR, the M1919, even the ancient water-cooled M1917 machine guns that were somehow still in service. This was going to be the machine gun for American infantry squads, the main source of firepower that everything else would be built around. Soldiers started training with it immediately. Remember, this is the Cold War now. Everyone's expecting that any day the Soviets might come pouring through the Fulda Gap in Germany and World War III would kick off. American troops trained relentlessly with their new machine gun, learning how to operate it, how to maintain it, how to fight with it as a team. But here's the thing. The first real combat the M60 would see, it wasn't going to be in the forests of Germany against Soviet tanks. It was going to be in the jungles of Vietnam. And that's where everything started to go very, very wrong. So the M60 starts arriving in Vietnam in the early 1960s, and at first, Marines and Army units are still using those old M1919 Brownings from World War II. When they get their hands on the M60, the initial reaction is pretty positive. I mean, compared to hauling a 31-pound Browning through the jungle on a tripod, the M60 seemed like a dream come true. It was lighter, more mobile, you could actually move with it during a firefight. Early combat reports coming back from Vietnam praised the weapon. Commanders were writing things like, "The firepower provided by the M60 has been decisive in multiple engagements." Soldiers were successfully using it to break ambushes, to provide covering fire during assaults, to defend positions against enemy attacks. The 7.62 NATO round it fired was significantly more powerful than the 5.56 millimeter round that the M16 rifle used. And in the thick jungle vegetation of Vietnam, that mattered a lot. See, when you're shooting through dense foliage, through bamboo, through triple canopy jungle, a smaller, lighter round loses energy fast. It hits leaves, branches, vines, and by the time it gets to the other side, if it even gets to the other side, it might not have enough energy left to do any real damage. But that 7.62 NATO round from the M60, that thing punched through vegetation like it wasn't even there and still had plenty of energy to hit whatever was on the other side. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army soldiers learned real quick to fear the distinctive sound of an M60 opening up. But here's where being the most effective weapon in the squad became a very serious problem for the guy carrying it. In a typical American infantry squad in Vietnam, you'd have maybe 8 to 12 guys, most of them carrying M16s or sometimes M14s earlier in the war. Then you'd have the M60 machine gun team, usually 3 guys. The gunner, who actually carried and fired the weapon, the assistant gunner, who helped with reloading and would take over if the gunner got hit, and the ammunition bearer. They called that third guy the mule because he had the worst job of all, carrying extra ammunition, which we'll get to in a minute because that's its own nightmare. Now, military doctrine said that when your squad got ambushed, which happened constantly in Vietnam, the M60 gunner was supposed to immediately open fire toward the enemy position and lay down heavy suppressive fire. The idea was to keep the enemy's heads down, give them something to worry about besides shooting at your squad, and allow everyone else to maneuver to better positions or get out of the kill zone. And it worked when it worked. The problem was that the Viet Cong and the NVA, they weren't stupid. They fought the French for years before the Americans even showed up. They knew jungle warfare inside and out, and they very quickly figured out that the M60 was the most dangerous weapon in any American squad. So their tactics adapted. When they ambushed an American patrol, job number one was to take out the machine gun. Take out the M60, and suddenly that American squad loses most of its firepower. The rest of the guys just have rifles. So M60 gunners became priority targets. Not just priority targets, the priority target, right alongside the radio operator who's calling in artillery and air support, and the squad leader who's coordinating everyone's movements. If you were carrying an M60 in Vietnam, you had one of the highest casualty rates in your entire squad. And it got worse. The M60 was distinctive. You could recognize it from a long way off. The shape, the way it was carried, the fact that the gunner usually had ammunition belts draped over him somewhere. When that weapon opened fire, it made a very specific sound. Nothing else sounded quite like an M60. And when you fired it from the bipod while lying down, which you usually did, it kicked up dust and debris that marked your exact position like a giant arrow saying, "Shoot here." There's this statistic that got passed around in Vietnam, and honestly, I don't know if it's precisely accurate or if it was one of those things that gets exaggerated to scare new guys, but they said M60 gunners had a life expectancy of 7 seconds after they pulled the trigger in a firefight. 7 seconds. Now, that's probably not literally true for every engagement, but the fact that soldiers believed it tells you something about how dangerous that job was. Despite the danger, though, the M60 was absolutely crucial. When it was working properly, it could break up an enemy assault. It could provide cover for wounded guys to be evacuated. It could suppress enemy positions while air support was called in. Veterans from Vietnam, even ones who had complicated feelings about the weapon, will tell you that the M60 saved their lives on multiple occasions. When bullets are flying and everything's chaos and confusion, having that volume of fire on your side can mean the difference between going home and ending up in a body bag. So let's talk about how the weapon was actually employed in the field, because this is where you really start to see both the strengths and the problems with the M60 system. The machine gun team, as I mentioned, was supposed to be 3 guys minimum. The gunner carried the M60 itself at 23 pounds, plus he'd have his own personal weapon, usually a .45 caliber pistol, plus his regular combat gear, water, food, everything else. The assistant gunner carried spare barrels for when the gun got too hot. Plus, he'd usually have at least 200 rounds of linked ammunition for the M60, plus his own rifle and gear. And then the ammo bearer, that poor guy, he'd be hauling anywhere from 300 to 600 additional rounds just for the M60, sometimes more depending on the mission, plus possibly the tripod if they thought they might need it, plus his own weapon and equipment. Do the math on that. A 100-round belt of 7.62 NATO ammunition weighs about 7 pounds. Just 7 pounds of nothing but ammunition. Now imagine you're humping through the jungle in 90-degree heat with 90% humidity. You're carrying 300 or 400 rounds of machine gun ammo. That's 21 to 28 pounds of nothing but bullets, on top of everything else you're carrying, for days at a time, miles and miles every day, through terrain that's actively trying to kill you even before you factor in the enemy. And here's the thing that made it even more of a collective burden. Since the M60 was the squad's main firepower, and since running out of ammunition for it in the middle of a firefight was basically a death sentence for everybody, each regular rifleman in the squad would also carry at least one 100-round belt for the M60, sometimes 2. So even if you weren't officially part of the machine gun team, you were still hauling an extra 7 to 14 pounds of ammo that wasn't even for your own weapon. But you did it because you knew that if that machine gun ran dry during a firefight, all of you were in serious trouble. Now, keeping ammunition clean and functional in Vietnam was its own nightmare. Early in the war, you'd see photos of soldiers looking really cool with ammunition belts crisscrossed over their chests, wrapped around their bodies, very dramatic looking, very Rambo, very Hollywood. The problem? After you've been walking through the jungle for 3 or 4 days with ammunition hanging off you like that, it's collected every kind of dirt, mud, moisture, bits of vegetation, insects, everything. The metal links that hold the belt together get bent out of shape when they're catching on branches and vines. You drop prone when someone shoots at you. You're lying in the mud with all that ammo. Then you go to use it and jam. The belt won't feed properly. A round gets stuck. A link breaks in the middle of a firefight when you need it most. So soldiers got creative, because soldiers always get creative when their lives depend on it. They started carrying ammunition in Claymore mine bags because those were waterproof and protective. They'd wire empty C-ration cans under the feed tray of the gun to help guide the belt in more smoothly. They'd make improvised handles out of coat hangers for the spare barrels because those things got hot enough to cause serious burns. They'd wrap the pistol grip with duct tape and wire because the plastic grip had a tendency to crack and break at the worst possible times. Some guys got really inventive. They'd take old radio backpacks that were being replaced with newer models, and they'd rig them up as ammunition carriers. Then they'd take the flexible ammunition chutes from helicopters that had been shot down. Vietnam was full of downed helicopters, unfortunately, and they'd attach those chutes to the M60. Load up that backpack with several hundred rounds all linked together, feed it through the chute into the gun, and suddenly the gunner could fire for extended periods without having to reload. It was heavy as hell, and it looked ridiculous, but it worked. Special operations units took modifications even further. Long-range reconnaissance patrols, LRRPs they called them. These guys would operate deep in enemy territory for days or weeks at a time, tiny teams surrounded by enemy forces. They couldn't afford the weight of a full-size M60, so they'd saw off the buttstock to make it shorter. They'd cut down the barrel to save weight and make it more compact. Was it less accurate? Sure, but that wasn't the point. See, when a 6-man LRRP team bumped into a company of NVA soldiers, which happened more often than you'd think, they didn't try to win the firefight. They tried to survive it. Their tactic was to create chaos and confusion, make the enemy think they were a much larger force, and use that confusion to break contact and escape. So they'd all lie down and open fire, but the guy with the shortened M60 would stand up and literally spin in circles while firing. The shortened barrel created a huge muzzle flash and an even louder noise than usual. Combined with everyone else shooting, it would make a small team sound like a whole platoon. The enemy would hesitate, go to ground, try to figure out what they were facing, and in those few seconds, the LRRP team would disappear into the jungle. But now we need to talk about the problems. Oh man, the problems. Because the M60 had issues, serious issues, and those issues got soldiers killed. So here's what nobody talks about enough. The M60 had problems before it ever got to Vietnam. During testing, before the weapon was even standardized, they were experiencing one major stoppage for every 2,000 rounds fired. One major jam that required stopping and fixing the weapon for every 2,000 rounds, and somehow the decision was made to accept that and send it to war anyway. Now 2,000 rounds sounds like a lot, right? Except remember, this weapon fires 600 rounds per minute. That means you could burn through 2,000 rounds in a little over 3 minutes of sustained fire. 3 minutes! And the nature of combat in Vietnam meant that firefights could last for hours. You might be firing on and off for an extended period. So malfunctions weren't rare, they were common. And they happened when you needed the weapon most. Let me walk you through some of the failures that could happen with an M60 in combat, because this is where the love-hate relationship really comes in. Some of these malfunctions were just annoying, some of them were dangerous, and some of them could get people killed. First, there was something called a runaway gun. This happened when the trigger mechanism, specifically the sear that catches and holds the bolt, would wear down over time in use. What would happen is you'd pull the trigger to fire a burst, then release the trigger to stop, and the gun would just keep firing, on its own, out of control. It would continue firing until either the ammunition belt ran out, or the assistant gunner would grab the belt and twist it to break the links and stop feeding rounds into the weapon. Now you might think, okay, so it fires some extra rounds. What's the big deal? The big deal is multiple things. First, you're wasting ammunition in the middle of the jungle where every round counts and resupply might be days away. Second, if you're not expecting a long burst and the gun suddenly goes cyclic and starts firing uncontrollably, it can jump around. You could hit friendly troops. People have died from friendly fire caused by runaway guns. Third, if it keeps firing long enough, the gun will overheat catastrophically. The barrel can warp, the receiver can crack. In extreme cases, the weapon can literally explode and injure or kill the gunner. Then there was the tendency for fired cartridge cases to have their rims torn off. The extractor would rip the rim off the brass casing, and the rest of the casing would be stuck in the chamber. The gun's jammed. You can't fire it. And to fix it, you have to take a knife or a cleaning rod and push the stuck casing out from the opposite end of the barrel while someone's shooting at you. Good times. On earlier models of the M60, the barrel locking system wasn't great. There was a release lever that you'd flip to unlock the barrel for changes. The problem was that in thick jungle, branches and vines would sometimes catch on that lever and flip it open. Your barrel could come loose without you realizing it. Guys would be walking through the jungle and suddenly realize their barrel had fallen off somewhere behind them. Or worse, the barrel would be unlatched but still sitting in place, so you wouldn't know anything was wrong until you tried to fire and the whole gun came apart in your hands while you're being ambushed. The gas system that made the gun operate was finicky. It had to be clean and properly adjusted or the weapon wouldn't cycle correctly. In the dirt and mud and humidity of Vietnam, keeping it clean was a constant battle. Soldiers learned to obsessively maintain their M60s, cleaning them every chance they got, checking the gas system constantly, making sure everything was properly oiled, but not too oiled because too much oil would attract dirt. And then we have to talk about the barrel change system. Oh boy. So in theory, on paper, designed by engineers in climate-controlled offices, the barrel change system was quick and efficient. In reality, it was a nightmare. You were supposed to change the barrel every 10 minutes of sustained fire at a lower rate or after about 400 to 600 rounds of more rapid fire. That's what the manual said. In practice, gunners would change the barrel when they started hearing rounds cook off in the chamber. What does that mean? It means the barrel and chamber are so hot that when you feed a round in, even before you pull the trigger, the heat alone is enough to set off the powder in the cartridge. The round fires by itself from the heat. When you started hearing the sound of firing change because rounds were cooking off, that meant you were out of time and you needed to change that barrel immediately or risk a catastrophic failure. But here's how you were supposed to do a barrel change according to the design. In the middle of a firefight, with bullets flying, you'd unlatch the barrel locking mechanism, then grab the barrel, which is now hot enough to boil water, hot enough to cause immediate third-degree burns if you touch it directly, and twist it out. On early models, there was no handle. You were supposed to use an asbestos mitt or wrap it in cloth. In the chaos of combat, with your hands shaking from adrenaline while someone's trying to kill you. Then you'd grab a spare barrel, line it up properly, twist it into place, lock it in, and continue firing. Burns from barrel changes were incredibly common. Both gunners and assistant gunners would have scars on their hands and arms from trying to change hot barrels under fire. Later models added a handle to the barrel, which helped, but the process was still dangerous and difficult under combat conditions. And all of these problems got worse as the war went on, because the M60s being used in Vietnam weren't being replaced. They were being used until they literally fell apart. Parts wore out, springs weakened, receivers cracked, and the weapons became less and less reliable. But they kept being used because there weren't enough new ones to replace them. Veterans who carried the M60 will tell you that they had a complicated relationship with it. On one hand, when it worked, it was incredibly effective. The firepower it provided could turn the tide of a battle. It could save lives. On the other hand, it made you a target. It was heavy. It required constant maintenance, and it had this tendency to malfunction when you needed it most. Some guys loved it despite its flaws. Some guys hated it and tried every way possible to get reassigned to a different position. Most guys fell somewhere in between. They respected what it could do, but understood its limitations. So the M60 saw extensive use beyond just infantry patrols on the ground. It ended up on virtually every type of vehicle and platform the military used in Vietnam. And in many of those roles, it actually performed better than it did in infantry use. Helicopters became one of the most common platforms for the M60. Door gunners on Hueys and other helicopters would mount M60s on flexible mounts, and they'd provide suppressive fire during insertions and extractions of troops. They'd support ground forces during operations. They'd engage enemy positions during aerial reconnaissance. The military developed a specific variant for this role called the M60D. It had a higher rate of fire. It used a spade-style trigger instead of a regular one. It had different sights, and it had specialized mounts for helicopter doorways. Door gunners had a complicated job. They were strapped in but hanging out the open door of a helicopter, shooting at targets below while their helicopter was moving and maneuvering. But the M60D became iconic in that role. When you picture Vietnam helicopter door gunners in movies or photos, they're almost always manning an M60. Riverine warfare units used M60s extensively as well. The Navy's Brown Water Navy operated these fast patrol boats on Vietnam's rivers and in the Mekong Delta. They'd mount multiple M60s on their boats alongside other weapons. These boats were fast and heavily armed. They'd patrol rivers interdicting enemy supply lines and providing fire support for ground operations. The M60s were perfect for this role because they could put out sustained fire, and the boats carried plenty of ammunition. Armored units used them too. Tanks would mount M60s as secondary armament for the tank commander and loader to engage infantry and light targets while saving the main gun for bigger threats. The M113 armored personnel carrier, which was everywhere in Vietnam, would typically mount an M60 on top for the vehicle commander. Some M113s were converted into what they called ACAVs, Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicles, and they'd mount multiple M60s with gun shields to provide more firepower and protection. Gun trucks became a whole phenomenon in Vietnam. The Army Transportation Corps and other logistics units got tired of having their supply convoys ambushed on the roads, so they started armoring regular cargo trucks, building steel plating around the cargo bed, cutting firing ports, and mounting weapons. M60s were popular on gun trucks, sometimes multiple M60s per vehicle. They'd position these improvised armored gun trucks at intervals throughout convoys, and when convoys got ambushed, these gun trucks would move to where they were needed and provide heavy fire support. Some gun trucks got elaborate names and artwork painted on them. They became kind of legendary within the units that operated them. Even regular soft-skin vehicles like Jeeps would sometimes have an M60 mounted on them for firepower during operations. It wasn't ideal. A Jeep provided no protection to the gunner, but it gave mobility to the weapon system. So in vehicle-mounted roles, the M60 generally performed better than in infantry use. Why? A few reasons. First, vehicles could carry more ammunition without worrying about weight. A helicopter or a truck doesn't care if you've got 2,000 rounds of M60 ammo on board. A soldier carrying it through the jungle very much cares. Second, vehicles often meant you had more people to help with reloading, maintenance, and barrel changes. A helicopter door gunner had a crew chief to help him. A gun truck had multiple crew members. Third, the vibration and movement of vehicles actually helped prevent some of the malfunctions that plagued the M60. And fourth, vehicles meant you could keep spare parts and tools handy for maintenance and repairs. But even with all these uses, even with all the modifications and improvements that were made over the years, by the end of the Vietnam War, it was becoming clear that the M60 platform had reached its limits. The weapon was showing its age. The design had inherent flaws that could be improved but never fully fixed without a complete redesign. The military started looking at alternatives, and they found one that had been around since World War II. The Belgian-designed FN-MAG machine gun. It was designated the M240 in American service. The M240 was actually a bit heavier than the M60, about 27 pounds compared to 23, but it was built completely differently. Instead of the M60's pressed steel and plastic components, the M240 had a solid milled steel receiver. It was massively overbuilt compared to the M60, and that meant it was more reliable, much more reliable. The M240 could fire tens of thousands of rounds without major failures. It didn't have the chronic problems that plagued the M60. It had a better barrel change system. It was easier to maintain. Yes, it was heavier, but soldiers decided that the extra weight was worth it for the reliability. When your life depends on your machine gun working, you'll carry the extra pounds if it means the gun will actually function when you need it. The transition didn't happen overnight. The M60 was gradually phased out of frontline service starting in the 1980s and 1990s. The M240 became the standard general-purpose machine gun for the military. But the M60 didn't completely disappear. Some special operations units continued using highly modified versions. The M60E6, a much improved variant with fixes for many of the original problems, saw some limited use. Some Allied nations continued using M60s that we'd provided to them. Denmark actually has M60s in service today with modern upgrades. But the era of the M60 as America's primary machine gun was over. It had served from the Cold War through Vietnam and beyond. It had been used in countless operations and conflicts. It had been carried by thousands of soldiers who had complicated feelings about it. Some of those soldiers are still around today, and if you talk to Vietnam veterans who carried the M60, they'll tell you stories. Stories about the weight, about the jams, about the burns from hot barrels, about watching the guy next to them get hit because the enemy always targeted the machine gun first. But they'll also tell you about the times the M60 saved their lives, about breaking ambushes, about providing cover for wounded buddies, about the sheer firepower it could deliver when it was working right. The M60 was a weapon of contradictions. It was too heavy, but somehow not heavy enough to be durable. It could deliver devastating firepower, but it malfunctioned too often. It was crucial to squad tactics, but it made you a priority target. Soldiers loved it and hated it, sometimes at the same time. It was supposed to be the solution to America's machine gun needs, a modern weapon for a modern military. And in some ways it was successful. It did provide squads with a man-portable general-purpose machine gun that could fulfill multiple roles. But in other ways, the many ways we've talked about today, it fell short of what was needed. The lessons learned from the M60 influenced future weapon designs, the importance of reliability over theoretical performance, the need for weapons to function in harsh conditions without constant maintenance, the value of soldier feedback in weapon development, the recognition that what works on a test range doesn't always work in combat. And maybe that's the real legacy of the M60, not as a perfect weapon system, but as a learning experience. A reminder that military equipment has to work in the real world, under the worst conditions, operated by tired, stressed soldiers who are being shot at. Theory is great, but practice is what matters. And in practice, the M60 was a machine gun that taught the military as much through its failures as through its successes. For the men who carried it in Vietnam and other conflicts, the M60 will always be remembered as the Pig, a nickname that captured all the complexity of their relationship with it. Too heavy, too prone to malfunctions, too likely to get you killed, but also powerful, effective when it worked, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and disaster. That's the M60, a weapon that broke more than just enemy lines. It broke down too often. It broke soldiers' backs with its weight. It broke the mold for how machine guns were supposed to work. And in the end, it broke under the pressure of modern warfare and was replaced by something better. but for a generation of American soldiers, it was their machine gun, for better or for worse. And the stories of the men who carried it, the real human experiences behind the technical specifications and the official reports, those stories deserve to be remembered. So there you have it, the real story of the M60, the good, the bad, and the ugly. If this kind of deep dive into military history is your thing, there's plenty more where this came from. Matter of fact, I've got a video about German pilot tested a captured P-47, and what he found shocked him. You can check that out next by clicking up here, and I'll catch you over there.